Hello and welcome to OctopusDo. I'm Christian Ross and this is my good friend, the cat boss, Nero. And we're hanging out in my studio today. And today we are going to do a project, another chainmail project. And Nero here has already helped me out by rearranging all of my rings on the floor. So we had to take a little bit of break to clean all of that up. But and he can't wait to do it again. So today's chainmail project is a little bit different than what we've done before. It's a Japanese weave. Now, the ones that we've done before have just been a Byzantine and a box, and we did the Mobius and rosettes and the shaggy loops. And those are all quite simple to do, and this is actually quite simple as well, but it's a different type of weave. Now, the box and the Byzantine involved weaving your chainmail rings and then flipping them around. We don't have to do anything like that. For this particular weave, the Japanese weaves, you have rows of rings that lay flat. And so when you're looking down at them, you'll see that they're flat and you can see the whole round ring. And then you have rows of rings that are going up and down, so they're vertical. So you have horizontal rings and vertical rings. Nothing's going at an angle or flipping or doing anything like that. So it's actually quite grid-like, and it's a very beautiful weave. And this one is going to be my beginner Japanese weave. We're going to call this one an 8 in 2. And what that means is for every 2 rings going this way, you're going to have 8 coming off. So basically everything's doubled. You're going to have 2 rings stacked and then 8 coming off. Now for this particular project, I actually used 2 different ring sizes. It wasn't really necessary. You can do this all in one size, but it needs to be the larger size if you do. Both of the ring sizes that I used are 19 gauge, which is an unusual size. So an 18 gauge or a 20 gauge in this would work just as well with no problem at all. But I got these great rings donated to me by my friend Gail DeLuca at White Fox. So let me give a shout out to my friend Gail at White Fox Beads. And they are a copper core with a silver plating on top of that. And so they're, again, the same types of rings that I've been working with so far, but they're a little different sizes, and I wanted to play with those. Now, the smaller size that I'm using is 19 gauge, and the inside diameter is 5/32. I tried to make the entire structure of this Japanese 8 in 2 out of this particular size, but what I found is the connecting rings that were the flat rings were a little small for the ones that were vertical to have enough room to spread out and make the structure. So you can see here that there's not enough room for all of these guys to have their own space around the table, so to speak. You know, they shift around, but when you try to get them to go into the pattern that you want, there's just not enough room. So that's why I chose to take that center ring that goes around and make it just a little bit bigger. So the size that I'm using for the center rings, that is 19 gauge as well, 3/16 of an inch. And that gives you a lot more room on the inside. So the structure of the pattern you're going to make kind of looks like this, but right now it's kind of a jumbled mess. So what I'm going to do is just show you what this looks like by taking, well, I found knitting needles. And I'm just gonna string this on. It's just like stringing beads, so I can hold this up for you so you can see the structure of the weave we're gonna make. So this is the structure of the weave that we're going to make. So basically, there are 2 rings that connect every 8 going around. It'll make more sense when we get into it. Now, what's going to hold this structure into place is we're going to take beads and run in between here on stringing wire. Where I have my knitting needles right now, I'm going to take beads in between, and that's really going to make this stay in the shape that we want it to. It's not going to flop around. So I'm pretty excited about that. This represents about 1 inch of a bracelet, and so I just want to give you how many rings that you're going to need for 1 inch, and you can multiply that out to whatever size you need. For 1 inch, you're going to need 12 of the smaller rings, which are the ones I'm going to call the arms. They're the ones that come out in spokes. And you're going to need 6 of the larger ones, that's the flat ones in the middle. So to spell all of that out, you need 12 of the smaller ones, 6 of the larger ones per inch. So if you're making a 7-inch bracelet, then you need 84 of the smaller ones and 42 of the larger ones. And I didn't include in that 7 inches, I did not include the clasp on that. So give about a 1/2 inch for a clasp. Now, before we start weaving, those are the rings you're going to need, but what are the other supplies? Well, you're going to need pliers to work with your rings, to open and close your jump rings. I particularly like using a combination of a chain nose and a bent chain nose. That's my favorite combination when I'm working with chainmail. You can use 2 chain nose, you can throw in a flat nose, anything you like, your choice. You just need 2 pairs of pliers, 1 for each hand. You also need, when you get to the stringing part, a pair of flush cutters and a crimper. This is the Omtara crimper, which is one of my favorites. You can also use a regular crimper, but that's what you're going to use to string your beads and crimp that down. So as far as supplies go, you're going to need your jump rings for your chainmail, obviously. A ruler really comes in handy, so you can measure your progress. You're going to need stringing wire. Now, I'm particularly using this bead-along stringing wire, which is a 7-strand stringing wire. Doesn't really matter what strand number that you use on this. So if you have a 19 strand or a 49 strand, that's going to work great. Not really a problem. This doesn't have to be an incredibly flexible bracelet because the structure of this is going to come from the jump rings. So that's totally up to you. The size on this is the 0.018 inch, which is your medium size for most diameters of beads. You want to use the largest beading wire that will fill the whole of your bead, and that's going to cause less wear and less friction on this stringing wire as the bead moves around on it. And so that's a good medium size. You're also going to need crimp tubes, total of 4, and you're going to need a clasp. Now, the clasp that I'm using for this is a 3-strand clasp. So basically, it's got 3 holes on each side for your bracelet components to attach to, as if it were a 3-row bracelet, and then it slides into each other, and that's how it closes. These are great for working with seed bead bracelets and all kinds of chainmail bracelets. So that's the type that I'm going to use for this. And we're going to crimp to it, and we're going to use jump rings to connect to it. Another thing that you can use if you like to cover your crimps after you're done is a crimp cover. So I actually have some of those. So I'll talk to you about how you can use a crimp cover over your crimp tubes. And then just to get a little fine tuning on your chainmail rings, like if all of your chainmail rings get dumped out on the floor by your cat boss, then you have to separate them if you need it. A millimeter gauge is incredibly handy, although you can just use your ruler if you like. But also, this is handy because after you start getting your weave down, and if you happen to be using a different size of jump ring than I'm using here today, then you have to measure the space between these arms, and that's going to give you the size bead that you can use in this project. So I'll come in here to show you that in between these arms, right at 5 to 6 millimeters. So a good 5 or 6 millimeter bead is going to nestle in here quite nicely. So I have a variety to choose from, but I have these check glass Druk beads. Really a clear color, really pretty on that, so that could be an option. Something that I love, it's always elegant, is a set of pearls. You could put pearls with your chainmail, which I find is a really beautiful mix. But something that really struck me and I couldn't resist is these check glass bicones in a light cyan color. So these are what I'm going with. Couldn't resist the fire. So these are the beads that I'll be using. I'd love to see what you make. Anyway, let's get started weaving. So the first thing that I've done is I've gone ahead and I closed all of my small rings, all of my small jump rings. I closed them all at one time. That's one thing that I like to do, as opposed to just picking up a ring, either opening and closing it, adding it in. I like to go through, determined about how many rings that I need, and I'll go through and I close all of the ones that I want to have closed, and I go back and I open all the ones that I need to have opened, and I should be good to go. I've got at least the 84 of the small ones closed and at least 42 of the large ones open. This right here represents what you need for 1 inch. So I'm going to start weaving. Take 1 of your large open jump rings and put 8 of your closed jump rings onto this one. So you can see, if I had stayed with that smaller jump ring, you wouldn't have had much to grab onto to close that. So 1 regular large jump ring, put 8 of the small ones on it, and close it. Always look close to make sure that your jump ring closed nicely. And if you are worried at all, just run your fingers over it and see, I can actually feel where that's not quite closed. So I'm going to come back in and try it again. All right, that's looking a lot better. The next step is to take another of the larger jump rings and you run it through that same path that you ran the first one. So I pick up a second large jump ring here, and I'm going to take all of this that's joined together and find an opening there and run this one through. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4, it's through 4 of them. Then I put the next 2, that's 5 and 6. And you see I've got these 2 loose ones, 7 and 8. And I need to make sure that this one that I just added does not go through the first large jump ring. You don't want them to cross over each other. So once you've got that set up, go ahead and close it. So when you're working with this, it ends up making this starburst pattern. And that's what will end up being your design. Let's keep weaving. So the next step is you're going to come off of 2 of these rings and keep going in one direction. So I pick up my group here. I separate everything out to where I have 6 rings on this side and 2 on this side. I grab one of my large jump rings and run it through those 2. So it looks like that. Then that's 2 of my Japanese 8 and 2. So I need to add 6 more. So I'm doing that. I'm adding 6 of the smaller jump rings. So I added 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And I close that. Come up here where you can see, and just wiggle back and forth to close it. Now I need to add a second jump ring, second large one, through that same path, just like I did before. Taking my large jump ring here, grab it in my pliers, and running it through those 6 that I just added. And yes, it gets crowded, it's okay. So run it through all 6. And then also through the 2 that are hanging off of that last unit. Close it. So there we go. So I have 2 that are my start here. And then I've got 2 that are wings hanging off that start, and 2 that are connected to the next group. And then 2 wings and 2 that will be connected to the next group. So basically, you just repeat this pattern. So I'll do that a couple of times so you can see what I'm doing, and continue that until you make your bracelet as long as you need to without the clasp. So the 2 that are in the middle on the end here, I'm going to add I'm going to add 1 large ring right here and put it through those 2. Then I string 6 more. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and close it. All right, and then because there's only 1 going through all of those, you need to add a second one, which mine are now currently under my cat boss here. He left me a few. And close the second one. And there we go. So I'll show you what we've got so far. Whoops. Looks like I only put that through the 6. I didn't put it through the 2 that were connecting. So I have to open that back up and put it through the 2 that are connecting. It's an easy thing to miss and an easy thing to fix. There we go. So that's what I've got so far. 2 rings, 2 of the large rings, and 8 going around it in the smaller ones. So just repeat this until you get your bracelet as long as you need it to be. Okay, so I have my bracelet now at about 6 3/4 of an inch in length. I wanted to stop here and say something, that if you have had a hard time working with this and getting all of those little jump rings to go easily on the 2 larger ones and reach down in there and close it, then fast forward to the end of this video and I'm going to show you a more step-by-step simpler way of doing this. This particular method is the one that I use. It's pretty much it's speed weaving because I'm adding several rings on at once, but it's a lot to hold on to. So again, if you're having problems with this, I'm going to show you at the end of this video a step-by-step 1 ring into 1 ring way to do this that's going to be a lot easier. So never fear, don't give up. On my bracelet here, I stopped at 6 3/4. I need to add 1 more group, 1 more link at the end. But instead of having the 2 rings that are joining and then adding 6 more, I'm only going to add 4 more because the next step is going to be adding the clasp, and I need to do connecting rings to the clasp. And I have the 2 connecting, I have the 2 wings, and then I have the 2 hanging off the end. So I'm going to grab 1 large jump ring and go through the connecting. So there you go. Just go through there, then add only 4 more, not 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, and close that. Then I go back and I add my second large jump ring that goes through all of those. So I grab the second large jump ring. I go through the 4 I added and the 2 connectors. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2, and close it. Now, if this looks familiar to you, it almost is acting like our shaggy loops, because those arms just move back and forth. But we're going to fill that area up with beads. I'm going to go ahead and attach the clasp because that's going to give us our anchor point to add the beads. It's on this end where I have the 2 that are connecting the last link, the horizontal larger rings, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So I split those, and that's going to give me the space for 2 more. But I need 2 small jump rings. So I make sure that I get 2 small open jump rings. So I go through the 2 horizontal, like so. Then I take my clasp, and I rescued it before Nero sat down, and I'm going to connect this bracelet to the center ring, like that, and close it. So I take my second small jump ring, and you know what? Oh, it does. I thought it was going to be too tight of a fit, but nope, it fits through just fine. So I'll just continue that pattern and put the other end through the large rings and close it. Now, while the clasp is together, I'm going to do the same thing on the other end. So basically, I'm going to take the other end and connect it to the other side. And the reason I do that while the clasp is still together is I cannot tell you how many times I have flipped the clasp and attached something upside down. So it's going to make it a lot easier while it's together to connect it, and then you can take it apart and you work with it flat still. Unfortunately, I have to move my friend here because I can't get to any of my jump rings. My dear, would you be so kind as to come over here? Oh, my baby. Good boy, good boy. You are a good companion. Thank you for hanging out with me. All right, so for the other side, I need 2 small jump rings. And I put 1 open jump ring through the end, and then make sure everything's lined up, and bring this around and connect it to the other side of the clasp, and that way I know that nothing is twisted. All right, I just have to add 1 more. My goodness, you're a good helper. Crafting with cats. It should be a sport, just like before. And close it. Make sure that's good. And there you go. Great. Now, I can open this up and still work with it flat, but I know that nothing is twisted. Now, the next step is to add my stringing wire and then add the beads. We might have to have some cat time first. That's okay. One thing I found out about cats, they love beading mats. So when all else fails, just move the beading mat and close your jump rings so that you don't have any help scattering them all over the floor. Now, I have all of these juicy red beads to play with. I have my stringing wire. I have my crimps right here. I'll need my cutters and my crimping pliers. Okay, and my bracelet, of course. Take your beading wire, pull some of that off. I haven't cut it yet. We're going to crimp this to one side of the clasp. So I've got the end of the beading wire right here, and I'm going to slide one crimp down onto it. So I have a crimp tube here. And if you ever have a question on what size crimp tube that you need to go with your beading wire, all that information can actually be found on the packaging. So basically this 0.018 inch beading wire uses either a number 1 crimp bead or a number 2 crimp tube. Pretty handy. Number 2 is also known as a 2mm or a 2x2. So that's what I'm using. My beading wire, I have one crimp tube on the beading wire. Come back to my clasp here. I put the end of my beading wire through that loop in the clasp, and then it loops around and goes back through the direction it came out of the crimp tube. Then carefully slide that up. You don't want that to be too tight up on your loop there, you want a little bit of space between because it's going to move. And you don't want to put too much tension on that. If you squeezed that crimp tube all the way up to the clasp with no play, no give on it, then it will cause it to stress and it will cause it to break. So while you have your wire going through here, right now, do you see how my beading wire is? If I crimped this, that beading wire is crossing over each other. The ends are. If I crimp it like this, then those wires are sitting there like this, and the point where they overlap will get squished, and that could cause it to break right there. So what you do is you need to make sure that your beading wire is parallel to itself so that when it goes through, it makes a loop, and then the two ends come out and don't cross over. I kind of think of it like the movie Ghostbusters, don't cross the lines. Well, that's how I remember it, at least. So it comes out parallel like that. Now I'm going to pick up my crimping pliers, come in here with my crimpers, and you see how there's a divot on one side and kind of a tooth on the other. I sit my crimp down in that divot and give it a light squeeze with the tooth. So, all right, give it a squeeze. And that crimps your wire. So I just turn everything 90 degrees and stick this back in my crimping pliers. Get back in the pliers and give it a light squeeze. We just want to fold that over. We're not trying to give it a death grip. It doesn't have to cut through the wire. So basically I folded it into a U shape and then continued going around. Now, to measure how much beading wire I need, I'm just going to hold this up and I'm going to cut this a little bit below the clasp on the other side, so I'll know I'll have enough to go through, make the loop, and crimp that. So I'll take my flush cutters and give that a snip. Now while I'm at it, this is just the way I do things, is I'm going to add my beading wire to the other side as well, and then I'll string each one as I go. It's the same process. Pick up a crimp tube, slide it on your beading wire, like so. Then go through your clasp end and around and back down through the beading crimp. Then you slide that crimp up to your clasp and give yourself about the same amount of loop as you gave on the other side. Make sure the lines don't cross and give it a crimp. So a little squish. Ah, there you can see, so a little squish. Then you can let go, turn it 90 degrees and do it again. Now you have two sides crimped, and I'm going to cut this the same length. Now we get to add these beautiful beads. So I'm not adding one right up next to the crimp. The first thing that I do is I'm going to run my beading wire through the first two loops. So pull that down. And I see where I've got this tail. I'm going to cut that tail off. There we go. And then run the beading wire just through the first 2 rings. And then I string on my first bead. So I strung 1 bead on, and then the end of my beading wire is going to go through the next 2 rings on the same side. And continue adding beads in this manner until you get all the way to the other end of your bracelet. So string a bead, and then go through the next 2 rings. Where'd you come from? So for my bracelet, I ended up using 20 of the 6mm crystals. Now I'm going to crimp the other end, but something that I need to point out here is you want to have enough slack in your beading wire, because when this completely straightens out because of the length of the chainmail, if you were to pull the beading wire together as much as it would go together between the beads, this will curve, and you don't want it to curve. You want it to be a straight line. So for example, if I just take this end and I pull it as tight as it goes, look how it bunches up. Well, I don't want that to happen. I want the weave to actually spread out. You have to move big. So I don't want that to happen. I want the weave to spread out, and I want those rings to be seen. And so I'm going to just pull this out where it was, and this is the length at which I need to crimp. So I grab my crimp tube, slide it onto the end of my beading wire here. Then I go through the loop in my clasp, just like I did before, back through the crimp tube. But before I crimp it, I'm going to make sure that everything is all stretched out. And not too much, because I don't want the beading wire to curl out either. So pulling that down. And I lay this down on my table. And I'm just going to pull on it until it gets to be the length I need it to. There we go. Everything's all spread out where it needs to go. So I'm going to hold the wire at that point, but my crimp tube ran down into my rings, so I'm going to pull that back up. Now remember, when you crimp, don't cross the wires. Right now this is crossed over, so I have to pick it up, straighten it out, and then crimp it. Give it a squeeze, and then rotate the whole thing 90 degrees and come back in and squeeze it again. So once you get the first side, trimmed and crimped and beaded and all of that, then what you do is you just repeat everything on the other side. Now, the most important thing to do when you are putting the other side together is to make sure that you have the same length on your beading wire as you did on the first side, so that things don't end up wonky. So this lines up really nicely. When I clasp it, you can really see how that's pretty. That turns out really nicely. Now, because there's a bit of a gap and a crimp is really obvious here at the very beginning, because you can't fit one of your beads up next to the clasp. There's just not enough room to be able to crimp that and do the beads. I like to use a crimp cover. So I have a selection of crimp covers here, and because this chainmail is so smooth and these crystals are so bright and shiny, I like the idea of using these larger, smooth crimp covers. So I'm going to grab 4 of those. Now, a crimp cover is simply a hollow bead so that you put it around your crimp and you close it and it ends up looking like a bead. So what you do to make that work is, again, I'm going to use my Omtara crimpers. You can use regular chain nose pliers, but if you do, you run the risk of squishing that rounded edge. And so I find that having something like this or a pair of Mighty crimp pliers, they're the larger crimping pliers, works well also. But I just come in here and grab that very gently, like so. And I'm going to take my bracelet here, make sure I can reach that crimp tube right there, and just slide this up and over my crimp tube, making sure it is sitting nicely in that open space. And just gently close this crimp cover around. Here we go. It's almost closed, but what I do is remove my pliers and just kind of press all the way around that to get it to close. Press here on top, because I want this to stay in this round shape. I'm going to actually have to pull this closer to my face, but you can see kind of what I'm doing. I'm just moving my pliers very gently around to get that to close. Just hard to see. So I'm just roll that around so you can see there's a little bit of a seam, and I'll probably go back in there when I get my magnifiers out. You can see a little bit of a seam, and just go in there and close it around and see what I can do to make that seam disappear. I'll repeat that on the other 3 crimps to make 3 crimp covers. But you can see how that really makes a difference the way it looks. So I'll do that and show you what it looks like. This is a pair of Mighty crimpers I was talking about, and you see they've got a very big jaw on them. So let's try one with the Mighty crimper and see how well that works. So I grab my crimp cover here and come in from the side. You know, I'm thinking I like the Mighty crimper just a little bit better for that, because that really nestles that crimp cover in there and holds the edge. So I'm going to do that on this side. Gently slide that on. There we go. Give it a little bit of a squeeze, and the ends start coming together. Now, you can see how there's a gap, and so I'm just going to come over the top with my Mighty crimpers there with that opening. And because it's rounded, I think it makes that go into more of a round shape easier. Yes, I like that a lot better. Gently press. All right, I'm going to pull it away from the screen here because I've just got to see what I'm doing. Sorry, guys. Just line everything up. Take your time. Squeeze that around. Yep, I like that. So I have 2 on, and I'll just go and use my mighty crimper then to get the other 2. All right, so I have all of my crimps covered and everything is all tucked in. So that's looking pretty good. Try it on. So again, with this clasp, you just want to slide it in like so. And it's a great fit. Very nice, very comfortable, and quite stylish. I like it. So quick and easy Japanese 8-in-2 chainmail bracelet with crystals. Really pretty. I promised you that if you are having a hard time getting all of those rings on, the big rings, and then closing them, if that was just way too much space taken up and you are having a hard time gripping that, I'm going to show you a little bit of an easier way. So the first thing that you do, I've got some of the large rings and some of the closed small rings. What you do is take one of your large rings and go ahead and try 4. Let's put 4 on there. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I have 4 jump rings of the small on one of the large, then close the large. Now that's half of everything because we're doing 8-in-2. Right now we have 4-in-1. All right, I want to take another large ring and it has to go through that same path. So I'm going to hold this here and pick up 1 large ring like so, and it has to go through those 4 smaller rings just like the first one did. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and close it. We have 2 of the larger ones going through 4 smaller ones. So what you can do at this point is if you set this down and you're looking at the design, it's 2 small, 2 large, and 2 small. Well, I need to extend that out into a bracelet, so what I can do is take a small jump ring and open it and add the 2 small jump rings to the 2 large. So there's 1. So now I have 5 going around here. Add another one. So small one going through the 2 large. Now I have 6 on there. Well, I need 8, so just keep going. So 7, and close it. You see how it's getting really crowded. So 1 more. And 8. And close it. So you see, you end up with the same configuration, but you don't have to try to get the large ring through all that big group of 8 smaller jump rings. You basically just put some of the small jump rings on the large and then add until you get to 8 and close that off. And that's going to make it easier for you to work around these. However, Like I said, I tend to want to add as many rings on as once and do as many steps as I can at one time just to make it go a little bit faster for me. But I hope that little tip helps you out. So as you can see, Nero and I are exhausted from this project. Don't let it get you down. Remember, as I always say when talking about chainmail, is how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. How do you tackle a great big project like this? One ring at a time. Trust me, I believe you can do it. And now you know, go make something. But if you liked this video, definitely give me a like, give me a thumbs up. If this was one that wasn't to your taste, that's okay too. You can give me a thumbs down on it. Just don't forget to leave me a comment below. I love reading your comments. If this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe. You can also click on notifications after that, and you'll learn when new videos come out. I really enjoy making chainmail, and I hope you do too. Stay tuned for our next project, and have a great afternoon.